Virginia Woolf begins her 1929 essay, A Room of One's Own, by stating that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction, and that, as you will see, leaves the great problem of the true nature of woman and the true nature of fiction unsolved. One of the main questions I keep asking myself in regards to this statement is, do we still believe it to be true? And if we believe it to be true, what are the conditions required for a woman to write fiction in? Aside from money and your own space, is it time, education, travel? I think that when Virginia Woolf says that a woman must have money and a room of her own to write fiction, she's not simply setting out a list of requirements. She's asking us to consider the privileges that these things afford an author and whether or not they're afforded to female authors. A woman likely wouldn't have had money because she wouldn't have been able to earn her own money or keep her own money. A woman likely wouldn't have had time because she would have been expected to be a full-time homemaker. And it's unlikely that a woman would have had access to good education. Maybe if she was wealthy, but even then her education wouldn't nearly be equal to a man's. And it's also unlikely that she would have traveled either because of all of these factors as well. And then the second half of Virginia Woolf's statement, the true nature of woman and the true nature of fiction. At the time Virginia Woolf wrote her essay, what had fiction done to the image of woman? And what were the harms that arose from this? That women were inferior to men? That women were not as smart as men? That women belonged in the home as wives and mothers? That women should be submissive to their husbands? And that a woman's only goal should be marriage? This leads us to the common role of female characters in most of fiction, that they end the book dead or married. So then what exactly is women's fiction, if this is how women are treated in fiction? Is it books written by women? Is it books written by women featuring female main characters? Is it books written by women featuring female main characters intended for a female audience? What makes this different from regular fiction? The answer is there is no difference. It's labeled as women's fiction so that it can be considered less than fiction. There is no difference. It doesn't matter who it was written by, who it's intended for, and who the main characters are. It's fiction regardless. When I think about women's fiction, I always come back to a quote from Emily Henry's Beach Read, where her main character, January Andrews, who's an author who writes women's fiction, states, "If you swapped out all my Jessicas for Johns, do you know what you'd get? Fiction. Just fiction. Ready and willing to be read by anyone. But somehow, by being a woman who writes about women, I've eliminated half the Earth's population from my potential readers. And you know what? I don't feel ashamed of that. I feel pissed." Virginia Woolf's essay touches on these same frustrations. So then, under what conditions are good books written? Virginia Woolf asks us to look back at female authorship in the early 19th century. She states in chapter 4 of her essay that the chief miracle of Jane Austen's novels is the fact that she wrote without hate, bitterness, fear, protest, or preaching. Austen's first novel was published in 1811, and her novels were considered good books in the time that they were published. So what conditions did Austen write in? She did have a home provided to her, but she was in need of money, which is likely what led her to publish her books in the first place. Her work was published anonymously, but her authorship wasn't known until after her death. The novel was also a developing literary form at this time. The constraints had not been set by men, and so this afforded her a certain amount of creative freedom. This also allowed her to experiment with the literary technique of free indirect discourse. And while her novels center on the dependence on marriage for economic and social security, they still end with her female main characters married. So why might Jane Austen play into the tools used to justify the oppression of women? Or why is she condoning marriage if it's a tool of oppression? It would be easy to say that it's harmful for her to condone marriage, but this completely ignores the critique that Austen poses in her work, and it also ignores the complexity of her female main characters. They're witty, intelligent, self-assured, flawed, and so on. And her characters do marry, but they do so for love. And they exercise what very little autonomy they have in order to do so. Austen's work serves to critique the fact that in 19th century English society, women did not have a choice in marriage. And in having her female main characters exert choice over marriage, she has to play into these tropes in order to make their critiques in the first place. Marriage isn't the true tragedy of her work, it's unhappy marriages. In Pride and Prejudice, our main character, Elizabeth Bennet, is proposed to multiple times throughout the book, and she continuously rejects these offers. She's not in a position to say no, and yet she does. In rejecting Mr. Collins' proposal, she states, "I'm perfectly serious in my refusal. You cannot make me happy, and I'm convinced I am the last woman in the world who can make you so." If Elizabeth did marry Mr. Collins, this would have been Austen truly playing into tropes used to justify the oppression of women. Collins points this out himself. Marrying him is a choice that's entirely in Elizabeth's favor. His situation in life, his connections to the de Burgh family, his relationship to Lizzie's own family, being her cousin, and the fact that he's set to inherit the entire Bennet family estate if Mr. Bennet dies. This creates contention between Elizabeth and her mother when she says no, because her mother is deeply anxious about losing everything, which is an event that's likely to happen. They're not on stable ground here. Elizabeth should say yes for her own future and her family's future, and yet she says no. Elizabeth also rejects Mr. Darcy the first time he proposes to her, and this is a man who has even greater power than Collins does. When Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth the first time, she rejects him because he insults her and her family, and it isn't until Mr. Darcy apologizes and proves himself worthy of marrying Elizabeth that she finally says yes. So then, what are the true tragedies in Pride and Prejudice? Charlotte Lucas and Mr. Collins, and Lydia Bennet and Mr. Wickham. Charlotte Lucas's family made their fortune through trade. At this time in English society, industrialization was reaching a peak, and families were able to make money through trade and move up into the middle and upper classes, but they weren't given a seat at the table. Their means of income was not considered desirable. They were not aristocrats. So why should they get to play at being aristocrats? Because of this, they're not viewed as respectable in the higher classes, and this harms Charlotte Lucas's chances at an advantageous marriage. She's also older at 27, and she's verging on becoming a lonely spinster. Where Lizzie says no, Charlotte says yes. Charlotte says that she isn't a romantic, that she's perfectly okay with a marriage with Collins for convenience sake. But her marriage is not a happy one. They don't like each other, and they certainly don't love each other. So this is a tragedy. This brings us to Lydia Bennet and Mr. Wickham. Mr. Wickham is known to be a bad man. He gambles away what little money he's given, he jumps from potential marriage candidate to potential marriage candidate as it benefits him, and he preys upon young women as well. Lydia Bennet is 15 when she marries Mr. Wickham, a decision she's in no position to make, and it's one that nearly brings about the ruin of the Bennet family. This is because the two of them run away before they are married and live together, and if Lydia had gotten pregnant out of wedlock, it would have meant social ruin for the family. The entire situation looks bad for the Bennets, and even though Mr. Darcy generously swoops in and assists them, it's still a stain on their reputation that will never really be washed out. Lydia and Mr. Wickham are even said to hate each other by the end of the novel, and this is a tragedy as well. Elizabeth and Jane Bennet have their respective arcs within Pride and Prejudice, but they do not compromise their core identities or beliefs in order to have happy marriages. They do not abide by the social expectations of 19th century English society. The true tragedies are the fact that women like Charlotte Lucas and Lydia Bennet have to compromise themselves in order to obtain security, and they certainly don't achieve happiness because of it. The message of Jane Austen's work is that we should strive for happiness and personal autonomy. And I don't believe we necessarily have to interpret this as marriage either. It was just her vehicle of critique. The very first sentence in Pride and Prejudice is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. It would be entirely different if she began the novel with a single woman in possession of a bad fortune must be in want of a husband. And I think that has everything to say with the actual critique of 19th century English society that Austen poses within the novel. To bring us back to Virginia Woolf's 1929 essay, an attempt to answer the question that she poses, what is the relationship between women and fiction, I think it would be easiest for me to talk about my own relationship to fiction. I didn't become an avid reader until high school, and it was because I spent most of my childhood feeling unwelcome by fiction. The stories that were out there, I felt like they didn't represent me. I didn't feel myself seen in these stories, and so I didn't want to read them. And it wasn't until I started reading romance in high school that I fell in love with books. Then, as I became an English major, even now, I find myself struggling to connect with stories that I know refuse to view women as people. I think that romance is also greatly devalued in the book sphere because it's considered for women by women. Why do we devalue romance when some of the great canonical works out there are romance? Woolf states in her essay that fiction is a subject that raises prejudices and passions. So what prejudice do we hold against women's fiction? And as a result, romance? I think that's a question that we all have to answer, and one that has stood the test of time, even though this essay was written almost a century ago.